Tune into Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St. Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on Nice Radio for A View from the Outside.
This society needs a spectacle. It might help us to see some evil. This society needs a spectacle.
On A View from the Outside this week being the 11th of January 2020, we look at dependent, D-E-P-E-N-D-E-N-T, dependent, with the view being that in an election year, it is imperative for Vincentians to ensure that they make decisions to secure a future which will end the syndrome of being dependent on others, in particular politicians, for mere financial survival. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines dependent as relying on another for support. This week's view is inspired by comments reportedly made by a magistrate in sentencing a defendant at the turn of the new year at the Kingston Magistrates Court in St. Vincent for the offense of possession of an offensive weapon, that is, a cutlass. It is reported that the defendant, a male, pleaded guilty to the offense. As part of the facts of the case, the defendant is also reported to have threatened to use the cutlass on his unemployed common-law wife. Other facts, as reported, are that the defendant and the complainant had been together for 9 years and have 2 children, one under 5 and one under 10. It also transpired that a mere 3 years prior to the incident for which the defendant was sentenced, he was fined for beating the said complainant on both her arms with a cutlass. During the sentencing exercise, the magistrates reportedly recognized the vicious cycle which the complainant found herself in, especially being unemployed and being dependent on the defendant for financial survival. He, the magistrate, is reported to have remarked that when women are jobless and dependent on men, the men have a tendency to treat the women with disrespect. That case and those remarks of the magistrates are telling, and within them are lessons for all Vincentians to be mindful of and to learn from. The case, again, throws the spotlight on the despicable violence and domestic abuse which women in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are constantly confronted with. And the remarks of the magistrate highlight one of the daunting consequences of being unemployed and being desperately dependent on someone else for financial support. We, on A View from the Outside, encourage all Vincentians to recognize and act on the teachable moment of this case. We encourage you to constantly keep the spotlight on the domestic violence and abuse which Vincentian women and children suffer with regularity in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We encourage you to report these incidents of violence and abuse. Make them known to the police and to the public. Offer emotional and other support to the distressed and broken women and children who are no doubt vulnerable in the circumstances. The mention of them being vulnerable needs to be particularly highlighted, especially when it appears that at the highest level, the nation, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, by its action, some say non-action, at the United Nations, seems to have very little or no sympathy for those who are vulnerable. It is worth mentioning that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the smallest country on the UN Security Council, chose to abstain from a recent vote on a UN General Assembly resolution which was aimed at protecting the vulnerable globally. So St. Vincent and the Grenadines abstained. We, on A View from the Outside, encourage you to recognize and highlight the fact that being unemployed or jobless is a grave disadvantage to anyone. Look at the fact that the unemployment rate in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is of astronomical proportions. Think about the fact that youth unemployment is over 40% and more realistically nearing 50%. And imagine the number of Vincentians who are dependent. We encourage you to recognize and highlight the disrespect which Vincentians, more so young Vincentians, are subjected to, and in many cases have to endure due to their predicament of unemployment and joblessness. A predicament which many believe is fostered and cultivated by the Unity Labour Party government in order to propagate the dependent syndrome to try to secure votes. Many believe that they do this by creating circumstances where all roads lead to the office of politicians, governing politicians, and in particular, one politician, for food, school fees, access to student loan, to be put on welfare or social assistance, to pay medical and other household bills, and for jobs. In all of this, we encourage you to remember the disrespect and abuse which Yogi Farrell had to endure and continues to endure. Also remember the young unemployed girls referred to as the Parliament girls, who are said to provide sexual and other salacious favors in exchange for financial assistance to men in the upper echelons of society, including the government. Girls who many believe fit the United Nations definition of being people trafficked and thus vulnerable. In all of this, we encourage you also not to forget the insults and disrespect which the unemployed Susan Duncan had to endure. Disrespect which was voiced by the Prime Minister in the House of Parliament when she was referred to as indigent and poor and someone who cannot afford to buy her own lunch. She was subjected to that kind of abuse and disrespect because of her circumstances and because she dared to exercise her right when she joined the front line to demonstrate against the results of the general elections in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in December 2015. Election results which are still to be determined by the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court of Appeal. We encourage you to recognize and highlight the staggering number of farmers throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines who were once vibrant and independent and who are now underemployed, unemployed, jobless, and not earning, and dependent. Many believe that the farmers' predicament has come about because of the government's neglect of the agricultural industry, including failure to secure viable and sustainable markets for agricultural produce, and also because of the enormous rise in predial larceny, which many have said the government appears to be powerless to curb. The farmers' demise has caused many of them to become dependent and thus been subjected to the kind of disrespect meted out in an abusive relationship. We encourage you to recognize and highlight the fact that recent statistics pertaining to GDP growth have shown that among the countries of the OECS, St. Vincent and the Grenadines languishes at the bottom. A fact which demonstrates the dire economic circumstances which exist currently in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Circumstances which contribute to underemployment, unemployment, and joblessness. And circumstances which lead to the dependent syndrome and which lead Vincentians to being subjected to insults and disrespect by politicians, and in particular, governing politicians of the highest order. It is in that vein, and because of the experiences which Vincentians now have of abuse and disrespect dished out, especially to those who are dependent, that we, on A View from the Outside, encourage everyone in this election year to be sensible and wise, to elect a government which is most likely to get you out of the downward spiraling predicament which St. Vincent and the Grenadines and its people are now in. To assist you to make those sensible and wise choices, bear in mind that people need to be gainfully employed rather than being dependent on handouts. Bear in mind that farmers need to have markets, viable markets for their produce. Bear in mind that the vulnerable, including women and girls, need to have protection and security. Bear in mind that businesses need to thrive, not stifled. Bear in mind that you need to have a nation living in a free and fair society, not dependent on politicians. And as we all brace ourselves for that time when those choices are to be made, let us all bear in mind the words of Malcolm X as a reminder. He said, as long as we stay in these conditions, we will keep begging him and he will keep us in control. As long as we stay in these conditions, we will keep begging him and he will control us. Until next week, this is Brereton Horne with a View from the Outside, with a reminder to you, Justin, and all of the listeners to send feedback as usual to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. You can also get us on Facebook at A View from the Outside and on YouTube at JMB Horne. Have a pleasant day, everyone, a pleasant Saturday, that is. Have a wonderful Sunday, and have a productive week ahead with everyone becoming involved and taking steps to rid St. Vincent and the Grenadines of the dependent syndrome.